We had some understanding on session and session factory. In this video, we're going to get some understanding on some of the terminologies used when dealing with objects in a session. So first of all, when you create an instance of a persistent class and that particular object is not yet assigned or is part of any session, then that object is called a transient object. Now Hibernate is not really going to treat this object as a representation of a database table row or anything of that sort. If you want that to happen, then you need to make use of some of the methods present as part of the session object and then use this transient object in some way or the other. For example, when you do session.save and then you pass in this object is no longer a transient object because it is now part of a session, and Hibernate is going to treat it as a representation of a relational database table row. So when we use this object as part of a session, that object is called persistent object. That means that object qualifies to get persisted by Hibernate. And after you perform some kind of an operation with that object, finally you would commit the transaction and then you would close the session. Once you close the session, that object is called a detached object, meaning it is now detached from a session. This object does not have any representation of a table row. So whatever the changes that you make in the transient object or on the detached object will not get reflected into the database. Only when you make changes to the persistent object will the Hibernate take care of mapping it with the table row in the database. It's as simple as that. So we have this sample code in here. I picked this from our previous example. So here I've just instantiated or created an instance of our persistent class employee. Now this object in here is not part of any session. So we can say that the user object in here or the employee object in here is a transient object. And then we created a session, we begin the transaction, and we call this method session.save, and then we passed this object. So now this object will become a persistent object. And after we commit the transaction, all the fields that we had set as part of this object will get saved into the database. And finally, once we're done with this transaction, we would close on session, and that will make our object come into a detached object. It's as simple as that. In our next video, we're going to explore some of the methods that are part of the session interface, and thereby you'll have better understanding. Alright, see you soon. In this video, we're going to talk about the following methods that are part of the session interface. First, let's talk about these two methods in here, save and persist. The job of these two methods is to transition the transient object to a persistent object. I mean, if you go back to the diagram, so we have our transient object, and once we call session.save and pass this transient object as an argument, the job of that method, either save or persist, is to transform this object into a persistent object. And once it does that, as I've already mentioned, it will now represent the actual row in the table. So now whatever the edits that you make in this object using its getters and setters, Hibernate will take care of updating the same in the database. But all those changes will not be saved immediately. They would be saved in some temporary location in a persistent context, and only after we perform either transaction.commit or session.close will the Hibernate save the details into the actual database. So let's see how it's done. So here we have pretty much the same code as previous. We're just using this method save to save this object, but it's not really saving the object, but it's just converting this transient object to a persistent object. So now after we do so, we can actually make some edits to this object. For example, I'm going to change the age, set age to 100 years. And now after I perform either commit or session.close, Hibernate will persist all those details into the database. So let's run the program and see how things will go. So now if you go to the database, you would notice that we have an entry added with age 100. I'm going to change this age to something else, maybe 200, or let's be practical. Let's set it to 56 and run the program. And same thing would get reflected in here as well. So the point that I want to make here is the save is not really saving to the database, but rather it is converting the transient object into persistent object, and once it does, Hibernate will treat that object as the actual representation of the table row, and whatever the changes that you make here is like you're actually performing those edits in the database. And transaction.commit will flush all the details in the temporary memory to the actual database. Well, Hibernate will actually take care of all that. So now instead of save, you can also use the method persist, and it will do the same job. Let's run the program and see how things will go. And sure enough, everything worked well. So now what is the difference between save and persist? Well, save is not really part of the JPA specification, but we do have a method persist in JPA specification. So just in case if you're planning to move to a different ORM tool, then using persist would make little sense. You don't have to make too many changes in your code. Another difference is that when you call this save method, it is actually going to return the identifier of that object or of that row, whereas persist returns void. So let me just quickly demonstrate the same. So we go here, make this to save. Let me get rid of this for the time being. I'm going to put the sysout statement in here, and let's try to run the program. But let's put some kind of a string in here. ID is or whatever, and run the program. And here it is. It has printed the identifier. So in some cases it might be useful that you take the identifier. In that case you can use save instead of persist. So essentially these two methods are same, they perform the same job, but they differ in terms of how they're implemented and the type of value that they return.